The story of the third atomic bomb is one that has been largely forgotten in the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet, it represents one of the most crucial moments in 20th century history, when the trajectory of warfare and diplomacy hung in a precarious balance. When the second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, most people assumed that America had exhausted its nuclear arsenal, that these two devices represented the complete extent of the Manhattan Project's deadly harvest. This assumption was completely wrong. Even as the mushroom cloud rose over Nagasaki, scientists and technicians at Los Alamos were already preparing the core for a third atomic weapon. And President Harry Truman was considering exactly where this next bomb should fall. The Manhattan Project had not simply produced two bombs and then ceased operations. The vast industrial complex that had been constructed across America, from the uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee to the plutonium production reactors at Hanford, Washington to the weapon assembly laboratories at Los Alamos, New Mexico continued operating at full capacity. General Leslie Groves, the military commander of the Manhattan Project, had established a production schedule that would deliver atomic bomb cores at a steady rate. The third plutonium core was scheduled to be ready by August 19th, just 10 days after Nagasaki. Additional cores would follow at intervals of approximately 3 to 4 days through August and into September, with the rate of production accelerating as the industrial processes became more refined and efficient. The third bomb was not merely theoretical or planned for some distant future date. It was real material and rapidly approaching completion. The plutonium core fashioned from the exotic element produced in the Hanford reactors was being shaped and machined at Los Alamos. The conventional high-explosive lenses that would compress this core to achieve critical mass were being manufactured and tested. The ballistic casing known as a Fat Man after the rotund shape required to house the implosion mechanism was being assembled. Everything was proceeding according to schedule, and military planners were actively discussing not just the third bomb, but a sustained atomic bombing campaign that could extend through the fall of 1945 and into 1946 if Japan did not surrender. The question of where Truman wanted to drop this third bomb requires understanding the strategic thinking in Washington during those tense August days. The original target list for atomic weapons had been compiled through an exhaustive process involving military strategists, scientists, and intelligence analysts. The Target Committee had met multiple times in the spring of 1945 to select cities that met specific criteria. These targets needed to be important enough that their destruction would demonstrate the bomb's power and convince Japanese leaders that continued resistance was futile. They needed to be relatively undamaged by previous conventional bombing raids so that the atomic bomb's unique destructive power would be unmistakable. They needed to have military or industrial significance, not purely civilian populations, at least in theory. Though this distinction became grotesquely blurred in practice, the original list included Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagata, and Nagasaki. Kyoto, the ancient capital and cultural heart of Japan, had initially been at the top of the list due to its size and industrial capacity, but Secretary of War Henry Stimson had personally intervened to remove it, arguing that destroying such a culturally significant city would create lasting enmity and make post-war reconciliation impossible. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck, two cities from the original list remained, Kokura and Nagata. Additionally, military planners had identified several other potential targets, including Tokyo, which, despite extensive firebombing, still contained important military and governmental facilities, and the industrial cities of Yokohama, Osaka, and Kobe. The evidence suggests that Tokyo itself was emerging as the preferred target for the third atomic bomb. This would have represented a dramatic escalation, as Tokyo was not just another city, but the political and symbolic heart of the Japanese Empire. The imperial palace where Emperor Hirohito resided stood in central Tokyo. The government ministries that directed the war effort were concentrated there. Destroying Tokyo with an atomic weapon would have sent an unmistakable message that no part of Japan was safe, that even the sacred person of the emperor could not be protected from this new form of warfare. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had received authorization to continue atomic bombing operations without explicit presidential approval for each subsequent strike. The order issued on July 25th stated that additional bombs would be delivered on targets as soon as they were made ready. This meant that once the third bomb was complete, it could be shipped to Tinian Island, where the 59th Composite Group waited with their specially modified B-29 bombers and dropped within days. The machinery of atomic warfare had been set in motion, and stopping it would require active intervention rather than passive delay. Truman's thinking during this period reveals the complex calculations of a leader trying to end a catastrophic war while grappling with weapons whose destructive power exceeded anything in human experience. In his public statements and private writings, Truman expressed both determination to force Japan's surrender and growing discomfort with the mass killing of civilians. After learning details about the devastation of Hiroshima, he reportedly told his cabinet that he did not want to kill all those children. Yet he also believed, based on intelligence estimates and the bitter experience of island fighting in the Pacific, that an invasion of Japan's home islands would result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese deaths. The clock was ticking in multiple ways during mid-August 1945. Every day that Japan continued fighting meant continued suffering for Allied prisoners of war held in brutal conditions throughout Asia, continued starvation and oppression of populations under Japanese occupation, and continued combat deaths in China, Burma, and throughout the Pacific theater. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan on August 8th, just as promised at the Yalta Conference, and Soviet forces were rapidly advancing through Manchuria, creating new geopolitical complications. Stalin's armies were demonstrating that the Soviet military machine, battle-hardened from 4 years of total war against Germany, could crush Japanese forces with shocking speed. This raised the prospect that if Japan did not surrender quickly, Soviet forces might occupy significant portions of Japanese territory, including potentially the northern home islands, creating a divided occupation similar to what would occur in Germany and Korea. The Japanese government was paralyzed by internal division during these crucial days. Even after Hiroshima, even after Nagasaki, even after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the Supreme Council for the direction of the war remained deadlocked. The peace faction led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai argued for accepting the Potsdam Declaration's terms for unconditional surrender, with the sole condition that the imperial system be preserved. The military faction led by War Minister Koshika Anami and the chiefs of the Army and Navy general staffs insisted on multiple conditions, including no occupation of Japan proper, Japanese handling of war criminals, and self-disarmament. This deadlock meant that even as Japanese cities burned and the atomic bombs fell, the government could not act. Emperor Hirohito's role became decisive, precisely because of this deadlock, in an unprecedented intervention on August 10th and again more forcefully on August 14th after an attempted military coup by officers opposed to surrender. The emperor broke with tradition and actively directed his government to accept the Allied terms. This intervention likely prevented the dropping of the third atomic bomb and possibly many more, but it was an extraordinarily close call. Had the emperor not intervened, had the military faction succeeded in their coup attempt, the atomic bombing campaign would have continued. The third bomb's plutonium core did arrive at Tinian Island, but by then Japan had agreed to surrender. This core, rather than being dropped on a Japanese city, ended up serving a different purpose. It became the heart of the fourth nuclear weapon ever, detonated not in war but in the test series at Bikini ATL in 1946. The infrastructure and expertise that had been mobilized to produce these weapons did not simply disappear after Japan's surrender. Instead, it became the foundation of America's Cold War nuclear arsenal, and the terrible knowledge of how to build and use these weapons spread to other nations, creating the precarious balance of nuclear deterrence that defined the second half of the 20th century. The implications of what nearly happened with the third bomb extend far beyond the immediate question of how Japan would have responded to additional atomic strikes. If Tokyo had been destroyed by atomic bomb, killing potentially hundreds of thousands more people, including possibly Emperor Hirohito himself, the entire post-war order in Asia might have developed differently. The occupation of Japan relied heavily on preserving the imperial system and working through the emperor to legitimize reforms. Without that stabilizing institution, Japan's reconstruction could have been far more chaotic and contentious. The demonstration of American willingness to destroy even the most sacred symbols of Japanese culture might have created deeper and more lasting enmity, making the eventual alliance between America and Japan more difficult to achieve. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, both conventional and atomic, represents one of the most troubling chapters of American military history. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 and 10, 1945, killed more people in a single night than the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. Dozens of other Japanese cities were systematically destroyed by incendiary raids designed to maximize civilian casualties and break Japanese morale. The atomic bombs were different not in their targeting of civilian populations, which conventional bombing had already made routine, but in their efficiency, their shock value, and their demonstration that a single aircraft carrying a single bomb could destroy an entire city. The third bomb would have continued this pattern, and the fourth, fifth, and sixth bombs that were in various stages of production would have followed. Some historians have argued that the atomic bombs were unnecessary, that Japan was already defeated and would have surrendered within weeks or months due to the naval blockade strangling its economy, and the Soviet entry into the war demolishing its armies in mainland Asia. Others maintained that the bombs were essential to achieving surrender without a catastrophically costly invasion, pointing to the military factions' continued resistance even after 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion. The truth likely lies somewhere between these positions, complicated by the fact that we cannot rerun history to see what would have happened under different scenarios. What we can say with certainty is that American leaders in August 1945 believed they needed to continue applying maximum pressure, including atomic bombing, to force Japan's surrender before the scheduled November invasion of Kyushu. The production schedule for additional atomic bombs in August and September 1945 reveals the extent to which atomic warfare was becoming systematized and routine, rather than special and exceptional. By late August, Los Alamos expected to deliver cores at a rate that would have supported 2 to 3 atomic bombing missions per week by September. The 509th Composite Group had multiple aircraft and crews trained for atomic missions. The infrastructure for transporting, assembling, and delivering atomic weapons was functioning efficiently. Had the war continued, atomic bombing would have become simply another tool in the American arsenal, used alongside conventional bombing, naval bombardment, and preparation for invasion. The uniqueness of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as singular war-ending events was not inevitable, but rather the consequence of Japan's surrender, preventing what might have become a sustained atomic bombing campaign. General Douglas MacArthur, designated to command the invasion of Japan, had initially been skeptical about the atomic bomb's strategic value, viewing it as a sideshow compared to the massive conventional forces being assembled for Operation Downfall. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, his views shifted and he came to appreciate how the bombs had obviated the need for an invasion that would have consumed vast resources and lives. Yet MacArthur also understood that occupying Japan and transforming it into a peaceful democracy would require preserving enough of Japanese society and institutions to function. The complete destruction of Tokyo by atomic bomb might have undermined this goal by eliminating too much of the existing governmental and social structure. The scientists who built the atomic bomb held varied views about its use. Some, like Leo Szilard and James Franck, had advocated for a demonstration of the bomb's power, rather than its use against cities, hoping that shocking Japan with a display of this new weapon would be sufficient without mass civilian casualties. Others, including Robert Oppenheimer and the majority of scientists working on the project, supported using the bomb against military-industrial targets, though many later expressed profound ambivalence about the weapons they had created. Still others, like Edward Teller, showed little hesitation about the bomb's use and actively promoted development of even more powerful nuclear weapons. These disagreements continued throughout the Cold War, with some Manhattan Project veterans becoming advocates for arms control, while others became supporters of expanded nuclear arsenals. The third bomb that was never dropped on Japan represents a historical turning point that almost happened, but didn't. In one timeline, the timeline we don't inhabit, that bomb fell on Tokyo or another Japanese city, killing tens or hundreds of thousands more people, potentially including the emperor, and creating ripple effects through post-war history that we can barely imagine. In the timeline we do inhabit, Japan's surrender came just in time to prevent this additional catastrophe. Though whether this was luck, timing, or the result of the emperor's intervention remains debated. What is certain is that the apparatus existed to continue atomic bombing indefinitely, that military and political leaders were prepared to use these weapons repeatedly until Japan surrendered, and that only the surrender announcement on August 15th prevented the third bomb and the fourth and the fifth from falling on Japanese cities during the final weeks of summer in 1945. Don't forget to subscribe the channel www.Untold